Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Mind Right Radio Show. We are have with us this morning Dr. Malik Muhammad, special guest host, and we also have a special guest this morning, Dr. Tamara Anderson. I know we mentioned last week that we were going to get together and talk a little bit about um, how people use their social media platforms. And while I think that is a very important discussion, and we definitely will circle back to that because it has been some interesting stuff going on as far as Nick Cannon and
Mm.
James Harden and some other folks that have done some things with their social media that have raised some eyebrows. It appears that, the topic of the week has really and truly been about education. So with that in mind, we definitely wanted to, address that topic and also bring on an expert to rock with us this morning. So with us, we have Dr. Tamara Anderson, who is the Assistant Director of Alliant International University's Teacher Ed program, as well as their Director of Clinical Practice. She comes with 20 years experience in education, and we definitely wanted to tap into her expertise about how the pandemic is impacting K-12 education and education in general, in addition to the expertise that Dr. Muhammad and I bring related to counseling and psychology. So welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm good too. Thank you for letting me back.
Awesome. So, Dr. Anderson, would you tell us a little bit about how you came to the education field and talk to us a little bit about why you have engaged in this work for over 2 decades?
Thank you. So, my mother always told me that I had this knack for always caring for people and always making sure everybody was set up. And I thought for sure my role was to be a doctor until I saw a lot of the books that you read and maybe became a little bit of a hypochondriac after reading about all the different diseases and issues. And I fell in love with teaching when I actually started babysitting students or children who I didn't know at the time had disabilities. And went further into that, and in college learned more about education and then special education, and took off with that, starting my career in Phoenix Elementary, in Phoenix school districts. And as I learned more, I saw that there were some things that weren't being addressed or could be better, which brought me along my pathway into the higher education field, knowing I wanted to know, well, how do we change this issue? Well, you have to be in leadership. Well, how do I fix this in leadership? Well, you have to be even higher in leadership and have a doctorate. And so that's where I went. And now seeing where some of the fixes could be, or where to have a better handle on things, is really starting with those future educators. So I'm really excited to be in a role in administration and also in leadership in my university where I can make those positive changes for our future educators.
Well, I just want to take a moment and just really, hand clap to you as far as being a woman of color in leadership at a university and really, making your mark there as far as, some of the things that you're doing with Teacher Ed. I think that's important for us as a community to really stop and recognize. There are some really powerful things going on in our universities where African American men and women are really taking the lead on, how our students are being educated. That is super important. So, Dr. Muhammad, you and I have been talking a little bit about the anxieties that families and individuals are feeling during this pandemic. And also, we've talked about the fact that there's this dual pandemic with the COVID-19, the racial inequalities, and now I feel like we've added like a third kind of
Mhm.
pandemic and layer with the changes in education. So can you share your thoughts about, now that there's this third piece that is becoming very real as far as kids, not going back to school in the fall. And I've
Mhm.
heard some families say that their kids may not go back at all next
Mhm.
year. Talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on that impact to
Mhm.
day-to-day life.
Oh, absolutely. And I preface this by I'm definitely asking, hoping Dr. Anderson will comment on what I'm about to say. But one of the things that I think I look at it as an opportunity for Black kids, for example. And what I mean by that is parents can actually teach our children in a way that they learn, especially Black boys. And what I mean by that is, and there's this term it's an educational term that I became aware of called the banking system. And most academic environments, all the way through college, use what's called the banking system, where they imagine that the person is like a piggy bank. And if they figure like coins, if I use words and I say it to you, it'll be deposited in your brain and then you'll be able to gain benefit from it. But that does not work. Everyone doesn't retain information in the same way. Sometimes it has to be formatted or presented in a different way for the individual. And I think that this is an opportunity for parents to really find out how their children learn. And that's one of the things that me and my wife have had to really adjust to, because I have my oldest son in the home. He can just hear it and he's got it. Whereas my second one, it has to just come through a different mechanism. I mean, he needs to be able to touch it. He needs to be able to process. He needs to be able to walk away from it, come back to it. And I know in a traditional setting, that's just not practical all the time. But one of the other dynamics is that oftentimes boys are taught next to girls, but girls, I'm even seeing that I have a daughter, they advance sooner. They are able to oftentimes metabolize information a lot faster and in a different way than young Black boys can. And just in general, boys oftentimes just need to move. They need to move and interact with things. And I think this is an opportunity to really learn how your child learns and then address the curriculum accordingly. I find with my wife, a lot of times she just wants them to sit down and listen and learn. That's just not practical at a young age. But homeschooling allows for that kind of adjustment without the fear of suspension, going to the principal, because every time a child is removed from the classroom, they're away from the educational moment. And then I think it's, we're talking about, the statistics are very blatant and clear that African-American kids, especially boys, get suspended with more frequency. So just add all that time away from the classroom sometimes, and then if they're add a learning disability in there, well, then they're going to do things to get away from it. Whereas at home, I think we can really adjust that. And I know that there's constraints around money to be able to buy certain things, but Google is free. And Google has a lot of resources for parents to tap into. The kid, what I found is kids will tell you what they need to learn if you listen to them. One of my kids, I found a free app on the iPad because he was having problems remembering his spelling words. So I just got on the apps thing, found a great app that he literally can study on my iPad the words, and it tells him if he got it right or wrong, because he has to enter the letters in for the correct spelling. And one of the things that we know about education as educators is you have to encode the data in the brain and make it kind of grab a hold inside the brain. And I just kind of played with that. Like, so here's this kid that's failing all these spelling tests, right? Because he couldn't do the recall right away. But we started doing this thing, this electronic version of it. Here's my A's every week. I was like, this is phenomenal. And the classroom actually ended up starting to use it. But it was me as a parent taking the responsibility to find that resource versus the school should be figuring it out. I do not surrender my kids to the school system. I just don't. And let me be clear, my kids are in private school. Okay, so to me, I had a higher expectation, but once I started seeing, they'll fail me too if I let them raise my young Black boy. I have a responsibility to kind of guide that. And so using all of my different experiences in my, go ahead.
So I want to touch base and Dr. Anderson, definitely get your input. First and foremost, you said that there is an opportunity, and I agree with you, but I also recognize that many families may be stuck in the anxiety of the process. This week, what are your thoughts? What are some things that have been coming your way?
I'm sorry, the question is for Dr. Anderson, correct? I'm sorry, I didn't know who was that.
Yes.
That was directed. Okay.
So what I think you
Yes.
were saying to repeat is that Dr. Muhammad made a lot of really good points that a lot of times the school has this task to teach children, but until you get on a bus or until you make a home visit, you have no idea what's going on in a child's home.
Mm-hmm.
We have an opportunity to know how they learn in the classroom. We know that we have audio learners, visual learners, mixed learners, how they learn in a different way, but that's in a completely different setting when they go home.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they go home, what ends up happening is what happened is we closed the schools and we said, here's some online, a way to teach. We're still going to make sure we meet our days. We're still going to make sure we meet curriculum, but we don't know if anybody was truly provided with the necessary training. And if it was training, it was a quick training. This is what you need to do. Get it online, go. And for parents, make sure they sit there, make sure they attend. We're all good. And it's not that way. When people are in their home, it's a completely different environment. Typically, kids are at school for 7 to 8 hours a day. They come home, they literally tear off all their clothing, and then they're free. Now we're saying that free space is now your workspace. And so to make sure that our students are being successful, we have to provide not only our instructors with the necessary tools, but we have to provide parents with the necessary tools. And I think that's maybe somewhere, and I don't know each person's situation. I know my nephews also attend a private school, a private French school, so I can't help them. I do use Google to translate, but it's different. Now you have a situation where parents are expected to do something where certified, trained people have been doing for years. And I think what you said is, how do we look at each individual student, those that are gifted, those that are struggling, those that have been identified with a disability, or those that were right on that verge and we never got them tested? How do we support those people? It's training. We have to make sure our educators are trained and really provide those opportunities for parents. Understanding that parents still are working.
Yep, good point. Yeah.
Understanding that there could be multiple individuals in the household, multiple families in one household. So
shared houses. I mean, if there's a mother and then there's a father, so then that splits the child's learning another layer to it.
There's so many, and that's such a great point. There's so many layers that are into this situation that could be so harmful, but at the same way, when provided with the necessary tools, can be amazing. Like I said, my nephew, who has sensory overload, struggles in a classroom setting, but who knew he would excel online? We never even thought about that. But then what happens when we take those situations and we really take the time to look at our faculty and say, okay, this teacher does well in this area. This teacher does well in this area. This teacher does well in this area. Do we need to departmentalize? How do we make sure that we're putting our students in the most effective situation in this uncertainty? I don't know what it's going to look like moving forward, but Governor Newsom did come on and say that if your county is identified in this list, you're not going back to school. There will be virtual instruction, but they're not going back to school. So it makes it a little bit difficult for our students, because now we're telling parents, even though you may be going back to school, guess what? Or back to work. Now what do I do with my kids? Now I have kids that are at home because the school system's not opening. So what do we do? So districts, it's a tricky situation. And as an individual in higher education, I have student teachers, interns, and clinicians who still need to learn, who still need those opportunities. And we have some school districts saying, no, sorry, we can't, we've got to figure out what we're doing on our own to teach our students, teach our teachers. And now you want me to bring in a student teacher or an intern or a clinician?
Wow.
Everybody's world is turned upside down right now.
Very much. So let's just project out. Let's just say the next 6 months. what do you, just kind of seeing what's going on, this is all being new, but what pathways do you see parents can kind of go to just kind of get, is there ways they can get support from their school district? And you're not a district representative, correct? Like we're just talking about what you're aware of. But ways that they is there ways they can get support for themselves, for their kids? What are we talking about when it comes to tutoring kids that have IEPs? Like, what are we doing?
So my background is special education. To the core. I will fight, I will claw, I will make sure my students are supported. But at the same time, what you discussed before, we have parents who are still working regular hours and sometimes even more. So how do we make sure that we can get everybody on the same page? These are just suggestions. I know I have partnerships with different districts, but these are just suggestions, and talking to parents and talking to teachers. Both parents and teachers are terrified to go back, especially since there's not a vaccine, especially because there's not a clear and specific plan as to what is it going to look like, because we know that just based on media that even though some kids aren't showing symptoms, they're carriers.
They're carriers, yes.
So, you're going to school, you may or may not be a carrier. And then it's just like that, what we learned in science in elementary school, where you put the goop on your hand and you shake the person's hand and you touch this and you touch that and you turn off the light and you see all the areas that have been infected. So how do we make sure that happens? People are terrified. And some people are saying, no, I'm not scared. I need to get my kid back in school so I can go to work.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's when districts have done this. They've taken the time to do surveys and survey the parents and take that information and devise a plan based on what the parents are saying. So what can districts do? Again, suggestions. Districts definitely need to have that ongoing and constant communication with parents. My neighbor was just telling me that she found out the same time parents found out that they were going to start school online.
Wow.
That can be a little frustrating for teachers, and also I'm sure for parents, because school's just right around the corner that's supposed to start. So that ongoing and constant and consistent communication is key. Also, when I know that I've noticed, I've gone on a few websites and I haven't been able to find the announcements. It's been very difficult to find those announcements as to what's going on. I have to click here, I have to click there. So districts should do something where they have a site where they can click on that says, COVID updates, or so parents can easily find that information, and it's listed specifically what's going on, in addition to contact information. One of the things that I take for granted are those landlines, where you could call the landline. Do you remember Movie Phone? And they would tell you.
Where was playing where and everything. Yes, I remember. Yes. That matters. Yep, that matters.
Because not all of our parents are computer savvy. And we also have students who are being raised by their grandparents who also don't have access to technology.
And I'm hearing that a lot in the therapy lane with the therapists that I supervise. Older adults who are parenting their grandchildren, there's a lot of challenges there. There's a lot of challenges there. Hey, Vanjie, you back?
Hi, Vanjie, which leaves another layer, right? So now we have another layer on top of that. So we want districts to be communicating. We want consistent and clear communicating in multiple ways. And then also, I learned that some of the districts during that instruction prior to the school year ending made sure that there were office hours for parents, so that there were office hours for parents that could call in to their teacher in the morning and even in the evenings, which provided opportunities for teachers to communicate just as we would before, but then also provide that flexibility for parents. But I saw something online that said, what about a parent academy? What about giving an academy for parents so that, hey, this is how you log on. These are the different visual platforms that virtual platforms we're going to be using.
Makes sense.
Here's how you sign in, a step-by-step, because, and even a cheat sheet. Give me some answers, please. I don't do math. I married an accountant for a reason. Right. So, and now we're expecting parents to check their work and make sure they're doing their homework correctly. Give them the answers so that they can make sure they're on the right path. So there's a lot of great things we can do to not only train our districts and our teachers, but our parents as well.
I like that.
Well, I'm sorry, y'all. I lost you for a minute, but I agree with what you're saying as far as the Parent Academy. And that was actually a request that I had of my own children's school, where they were using Google Classroom. And while I have a general idea of how it works, I was like, I need to set up a time for you to walk us through this. Now, mind you, I have several degrees, work in education. It was like, take some time. I need you to pause and walk me through this, because I want to make sure that, you know, my my children are where they need to be, and that I'm understanding exactly what the expectations are. So I absolutely agree with that point.
That is.
So I know, you know, sort of circling back to what you were saying, Dr. Muhammad, about this being an opportunity, understanding our children's individual learning styles. There was a question on Facebook about, you know, why is it that there's this trend among educators and within the education system where African-American children are often identified as attention deficit? I think there is a connection there, because the reality is, you know, our kids learn very different. You know, I always found it fascinating when my kids were little and the teachers, you know, put something that they were learning to song, where there was dance and there were movement. I mean, they aced those, you know, units as far as what, you know, the teacher was describing. So I think there's this real expectation, and you can definitely see this in some of the old school schools and even some of the old school private schools, where it's like, sit in your desk, do your work, and done, without integrating any like real movement or music or, you know, sort of integrated learning styles. And I think that has, you know, kind of contributed to, you know, our children of color being often getting that label where that may, you know, not always be the case. Do either of you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. I definitely one of my favorite methods, and what they coded is I think what we would label as the Montessori method. But I think that all kids perform well under, but as we narrow it down to African American kids, I think older African American kids teaching younger African American kids certain things has a value, especially as the kids get older, because a lot of times sometimes the kids don't want to listen to the parents or listen to the teachers, but an older student can have an impact. And I think that was very common, because I grew up in Chicago. I went to private school, and we worked together. It was something about the daycare and stuff. There was a working together kind of a cultural feel to the environment. And I think when you move from that to a do it on your own environment, I think sometimes our kids are set up to fail, not intentionally. And I'm not calling malice. I'm just saying, as far as learning styles, because we come from a collective culture. I think in America, by design, is an individual culture as being capitalist. So it's counter to how we may learn best, which is together. And so I definitely think that if we can use this moment to really develop mechanisms for our kids to work together, and this requires the parents to make these connections. You and your friends are going to be online for 3 hours figuring this homework out together. And I mean, there'll be adult supervision or maybe a tutor engaged and stuff like that. But I mean, I think that goes a long way. But again, it does require parent participation, and I know that that's hard when you're working. But also, I feel like this is an opportunity to get some resources from your school that may not have been in place for you before. But I think you can request anything with a good shot of getting it at this point, because school districts still have the obligation to keep your child at a certain level of education and learning. And if you need a co-teacher or someone to come on later on, like, that doesn't seem like an unusual request, which I think is interesting when Dr. Anderson saying schools don't want to necessarily bring on other teachers right now, or student teachers. This is exactly when you bring them on. We need more hands on deck. This is not the time to be like, we're going to work with what we got. Well, a lot of the ones you had anywhere were burnt out. Now they got to learn to teach online.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be blunt. They were barely teaching in person. I mean, so now they got to teach online. Like, no, I know they sitting at home saying, no, I'm not going to do that. Whereas I think that new blood, I'm calling the student teachers new blood, I think that would fit right in their lane. And divide the labor, you know, my thoughts. So I'm not a formal educator in that way. So I know that there's things involved in pedagogy, but as an outsider, that's how I see that it could work better, not more difficult.
Sure. Dr. Anderson, do you have thoughts on like, you know, as Dr. Muhammad was speaking on, you know, peers, older peers sort of supporting the younger kids?
Right. So
sort of quarantined.
Dr. Muhammad, you are spot on. I mean, I'm just, amen, brother. So here's what I in the classroom, what typically happens is you have teachers are so overwhelmed, you know, 30 plus kids in a classroom.
Crazy. That's crazy. That's crazy.
They have, often what happens is you have the higher functioning student working with the lower functioning student. Okay. But that higher functioning student misses out on those opportunities. So as these teachers are co-planning and planning together, why not have those opportunities to say, okay, if you have a younger brother or spouse, why don't you do X, Y, Z, so that they can not only, most of us take pride in our older siblings. I know I love my brother. You know, there were plenty of fights as we were younger, but I look up to my older brother, and I look for things, especially not having a father in the house. I definitely look up to my older brothers. But what an opportunity to take a leadership role in your household, but also that fun caring, you know, doing math, throwing the ball back and forth, doing facts, math and addition, subtraction facts, or, you know, putting paper plates and writing letters and doing your spelling words that way. And not looking at the older sibling as a supervisor, but as someone who's playing a game with them and teaching them and helping them learn and grow through this difficult time. Because, you know, one of the things that we're learning is that a schedule is huge. I love schedules. I love schedules, and being flexible, but making sure students know, hey, this is a learning time. This is a fun learning time. This is a creative learning time, and bringing in those opportunities for movement and meaningful. Sometimes we give students work and it's busy work. How not work with those older students and say, hey, you know, here's a book. How could you translate this to make sure your kindergarten brother or sister understands this? Or how can you help your brother talk about the steps? Every opportunity is a learning opportunity, but then what a great way to bring a family together.
So when you talk about, you know, the siblings sort of participating in that, one of the things that comes to mind for me is parentification. Now, by the siblings helping another sibling, would that act sort of contribute to, you know, an older sibling being parentified and, you know, leading to them having some feelings of resentment? I just want to, you know, unpack that a little bit, because I agree that, you know, older siblings or cousins could be really helpful, but are we sort of straddling the fence of, you know, adding some stress on that relationship because, you know, regardless of how we title it, that person does assume sort of a parent role. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. So let me say, as I think about the dynamics of my younger ones coming up right now, the oldest one of the batch think he daddy anyway. And so my thing is, let me not work against the stream. Let me try to guide it. Okay. So if you think you daddy, then let me at least, I'm going to designate you your responsibilities. And I think that's fair, but he's not allowed to tell the kids when to go to bed. He ain't allowed to whoop them. He ain't allowed to spank. Like, you know, there's boundaries around that. But I think that's normal. And I really feel like that comes from a village mentality. I think it's the individual mentality of, they all get to grow up and be individuals and this and that. And yeah, that sounds nice. But I always had the same theory versus application. Like, that sounds nice in theory, but we still live in the house together. This is a unit. I'm in charge. I can't have a bunch of different armies in my house. Well, you know, we have 4 kids at home now. I told my wife, look, they outnumber us now. We got to tighten up. Like, we gotta be on the same page, or we're gonna be in trouble as they start getting these brain cells together. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Right. And so within that, let me assign your roles in this army until you get out. Right. Mm-hmm. So I do appreciate what you're saying, because I see sometimes when my oldest one, can overstep his bounds, but that's my responsibility to rein that in. Right. I don't. That's my job as father in this unit, sure. Right? But I mean, I think one of the best uses is, look, this is, you can do more, so I'm going to have you do more. Not, well, you lucky
Sure.
you get more free time now. Nah, no.
Right.
Because these
Right.
are really,
Right.
these are literally neurologically developing minds, and it's important what gets
Mhm.
attached to it. So I got to figure out how much stuff can I pack in it without burning it out. But also too, I think that by teaching, my oldest son is also relearning the information himself. So I don't think it's a
Sure.
moot
For
point. You know
sure.
what I mean?
Absolutely.
I don't think it's a moot point. I think he still gains from it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Well, I also want to just make sure that we touch upon, the achievement gap and the educational divide that already, existed before the pandemic.
Mm.
So now we have kids that, are not in school, and some are on track to not be in school for a full year with this very modified distance learning model. How is that going to impact the educational divide? And I also want to talk a little bit about sort of typical regression that happens, like, during the summer.
Yeah.
And now we have like this, possibly year-long, separation from school, and what that will do to, regression. So what are your thoughts?
Well,
Dr. Anderson?
oh, thank you, sir. So regression is, the loss of a skill that takes place, during long periods of breaks. We know that with our learners with disabilities, sometimes if that regression is so severe, it's identified within their IEP as extended school year. We don't know how school districts are supporting that extended school year, which is why it's so important that student and
I'm sorry,
parent.
can you define that, please? I don't know what that means, extended school year. What
So
is that?
extended school year is when so I'm going to give an example, and it's the example that I always taught when I was an administrator to faculty is, this is what a regression is. So if a student, let's say that they are being taught how to eat, right? They're being taught how to eat, and that if they don't get that ongoing practice on a regular basis, if they don't get those skills needed to do those essential skills, they're going to miss out on that. If that impact is greater upon a loss during a period of time, that student typically qualifies for extended school year, which then allows that learning to go on a regular basis. So there's no learning gaps or missed opportunities, interruptions, if I can say. There's no interruptions. So that student always gets that skill. So if they notice that there's a regression in that skill, then they can get that extended school year. That's a long story short. So with our students, sometimes we have typically students qualify for summer school when they fail a course.
Right.
Or I know when I was in high school, I failed geometry and ended up in summer school.
I was there a couple of times. I planned for it.
So, wouldn't it be great if we had an opportunity to attend those sessions during the summer? If we knew students struggled, not because they failed, but to make sure, but that's what we had summer camps for, and that's why we had all these great things. So we don't have those anymore. So
you don't have what?
Summer camps, because everything closed.
Gotcha. Right, you're right. Because this normally people be getting additional service or additional help right now. You're right.
Right.
So yes, there is going to be a regression. So, but that's where the school districts could come in and say, during the summer, have you tried these things, and work with the related service members, the occupational therapists, the physical therapists, the mobility, all those wonderful people who support our learners with disabilities. Are they getting together with parents to teach them and educate them? Here are some sites, here are some resources to make sure your child doesn't regress during the summer. Now, our students that typically make those ongoing growths, there is going to be regression. I know a lot of times during the summer, kids become really well at surfing the TV, recording their parents' television shows for them, video games. I'm still learning how to play some video games. I don't do well, and my nephew will not play with me online. But those are things that I am working on. I'm practicing. Just like that, our students need to remember, our kiddos need to do that during the breaks too. They shouldn't just be hanging out watching TV. There's different things, chores are great. I think chores are great, and they teach responsibility, especially, when there's the positive outcome. And we have to teach kids that we do things not because we're told to do them, but because there's a benefit in them. Even though they may not see the benefit, there is a benefit. You know, just like I encourage my husband.
Chores could be the new PE, right? I mean, you know.
I agree. They're not.
Let's make it work.
You're right. I mean, the things that I hate, like PE for school, when I heard they don't have it anymore, I just was like, where are we going? Where are we going? Where are we going?
Gardening.
Well, I mean, there you go. Exactly. Well, I think that, you know, the things that we're talking about as far as, you know, the opportunities and the positive things that can come out of, you know, kids being educated at home, you know, I just want to make sure that we are really acknowledging the fact that parents are quite nervous and anxious about their children's development. Well, let me back up. I would say there's a portion of parents that are really nervous about their children's development. And we have another portion of parents whose primary concern is about, you know, the impact to their ability to work, the impact on, you know, childcare and resources. And then we also have a pocket of parents who also just say, hey, this is an extended summer break. I don't have the time, energy, or know-how or bandwidth to assume this role, so I'm not even going to worry about it. So whatever learning, you know, my child gets, awesome, and what they don't get, you know, I'm sorry, but hey, I'm not in a position to impact that. So if we can talk a little bit about those groups. So if we can maybe start with the group that is in a place of like, hey, I'm overwhelmed and, you know, there isn't much that I can do here, and it is what it is, and this is extended playtime, and these aren't things that I'm going to enforce or put energy in or buy learning materials or Google stuff for them to do. Let's talk a little bit about where that is coming from and how we can help those families make a shift to be a bit more invested.
Dr. Muhammad?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's sometimes a level of apathy when people become overwhelmed. And that speaks to kind of my area, the mental health part of this kind of environment. What's going on? I think that sometimes we're dealing with people that were already overwhelmed. And then we give them a critical task on top of everything. So, you know, grandmother, grandfather raising their children. One real example, I know that one of the cases I'm supervising right now with a therapist is overwhelmed granddad who's watching his grandson who was already getting suspended from school, barely doing any work. And now that grandfather who was kind of like, I don't care what happens to him anyway because he won't listen, is responsible for giving him homeschool. Like, so, and no one's checking up. Only reason why this came on the radar for the therapist is because the child was about to fail. And then the grandfather was kind of scrambling to beat up the school system to make them pass. And they were like, but we've been trying to email you, call you this whole time. So I think that, so the traditional reaction is, well, you should have did what you were asked to do for your grandson. The clinician in me says, I think there needs to be some empathy. I know you're overwhelmed. I know this is frustrating. And also kind of maybe be aware that maybe the grandfather has his own learning disabilities. So I think there needs to be an oversharing of empathy and resources to these parents or any parent thrown in these situations. And I think the offer needs to be made regardless of the circumstance. So I think school systems need to say, what challenges are you facing? How can we help you with these? And email us your child's name, student ID number, so we can start addressing these for your child. Because essentially, every child is going to need an IEP right now. That's essentially what this is going to look like. And really then address those needs instead of putting it in the lap of the parents. Because that wasn't their job anyway. But I think that empathy is what really can go a long way because it breaks down the resistance. You know what I mean? So to listen to the parents.
You know what?
Go ahead.
I agree with what you're saying wholeheartedly. And I think that what I'm seeing from my perspective is that the educators are kind of stuck in their own feelings about what is happening, how this impacts their role, that the crossover to, hey, I'm now in a space to be empathetic and how can I help you and what can I do for you, is where the struggle is. Like, how do I get out of my own feelings in order to be able to deal with yours? Now, as mental health professionals, you and I get that. Regardless of how my day is looking, that clock starts or that client walks in the door, I need to shelf whatever Dr. Vanjie is going through, and I need to be, laser focused on what my client is going through. But what I'm seeing is educators, and you can see this with school districts in there, the delay in the development of their distance learning plans, that they are so busy, like analysis paralysis, that meanwhile, nobody got helped.
I just think about the sentence you just said. The school system is developmentally delayed. How about that? How about just as a concept, we're seeing it. We're seeing it. Yeah. I like the way you said that, because there is paralysis in analysis of all the different things. Meanwhile, our children need help.
Exactly. And that trickles down, like the school district struggling, then the administrators, then the teachers. Then meanwhile, the kids are still, riding their bikes and skating. And meanwhile, no learning is occurring. So,
they are.
I mean, it's the truth. So then, as parents, you have that group that is sort of, apathetic and, not purposely apathetic, but just, kind of picking up on some of the energy that's already out there and acknowledging that they don't have the tools or the know-how, and just like, all right, it is what it is. So if we can shift a little bit and talk about that group who is acutely aware of the challenges of, sort of trying to wrap their head around the long-term impacts, and are really anxious and, trying to unpack their own feelings of like, oh my gosh, my child is, in elementary school and missing a year of some really fundamental things. How will that translate to middle school and high school? In my mind, I guess my thought is like, at least our high schoolers have had elementary and middle school, so they have a foundation and have a general understanding of what learning is supposed to look like, how to study, how to take notes. But then you have those late elementary, middle school kids that, have yet to develop those skills. That I think that my bigger concern are with those kiddos. So, those parents, those parental anxieties, how do we help those parents sort of pause, reframe, and sort of look at the opportunities in front of them?
Okay. Dr. Ansher, I'll just say one sentence and then give it to you. But the one thing that came to mind is this is happening to all kids at the same time. That's the positive of it, right? So no child was segregated out and withheld during this environment. So they're all being affected. So whatever gap was there will be there for another child, unfortunately. So the accommodations will also be needed in the same way on some level. So that's one thing. So it doesn't put just one group of kids behind. It impacts them all. Okay, Dr. Anderson?
That's a really good point. And I just wanted to just circle back to what we were talking about previous, that, when schools did their surveys and they asked, I often wonder how much out of all the people they surveyed, what was the response back? What was the percentage of the response back?
Good point.
Because did they know, or did somebody, it would have been great to have counselors follow up on the concern area, because as
very good point.
The okay group, the group that's excelling, and that group that's concerned. Wouldn't it have been great to have our counselors address those concerns to make sure that those parents who may have a learning disability or maybe not have the sources to guide them in the right direction? So I just kind of wanted to throw that out, because now that, me, I'm all about making sure everybody has a place and make sure we can support everybody. So with those parents who, understand what's going on, have the opportunity to make sure their kids are set and have their device and good, but still very anxious, I think we first need to let them know that it's okay. It's okay to be anxious, and it's okay to be scared, and it's okay to be worried, because if you're not, then I'm concerned as an educator.
Great point.
Absolutely.
That's the empathy.
Absolutely.
That's the empathy. That's the empathy I'm saying.
But what a great way to bring in, as we talked about before, Dr. Muhammad, making sure that our student teachers can be that extra support for our teacher of record, but then also have our counselors and our clinicians that are doing their interns be there as well to make sure that we're on a right source. We talk about how restricted we are because districts are limited with funding, but there's free help.
There's free labor, trained labor.
Exactly.
These are just people that just rolled in off the street. Like there's a process before they can do it.
Right. Well, the other thing that's sort of in the mix of all of this, going on about, schools not starting is the measure that is out there as far as restricting the funding for charter schools. Now, most of the online schools are, in fact, charter schools.
Okay.
So essentially, what is on the docket that the charter schools will only be given a budget based on last year's enrollment. So, for example, if now parents are under the understanding that, in-person schools will not happen, and parents say, okay, no problem, I'm going to look up, my local online charter school and have my children go there because there's a curriculum, there's a plan, they're not trying to figure it out. This is something that they've been doing. Well, newsflash, those families won't have an opportunity to enroll because the online charter schools are now not in a position to increase enrollment. So that is not even an option. So I know that there are lobbyists really trying to adjust the narrative and in hoping that, that does not pass and that, the government will reconsider the funding to charter schools. But if parents were thinking, okay, boom, I'm just going to make the shift, if they aren't already accepted in a charter school, and if that charter school, doesn't have room to grow within last year's budget, that is not even an option.
Oh my God, that's awful.
So, the plight of education is very real right now. I think that it is important that districts are able to sort of move past their analysis paralysis and really take advantage of those graduate students that need the hours, because I do think that could be really helpful. But right now, our families are in between a rock and a hard place. Like there are next to no, options aside from whatever the school district puts in front of them. What I have seen is I've seen, some articles written about families then considering private school versus public school. What they are saying is that because private schools have a lower enrollment, that they are in a better position to be able to implement social distancing, so that some of those schools may be considering, going ahead and having in-person learning. I don't know if that, if that will pan out, but I know that that's also a consideration where families are thinking about that shift because of the smaller numbers.
But the problem with going to some private schools, not all, is the cost. And if we have families that are already struggling, that option is completely off the table because the cost is so significant, which still puts families out of bind. It kind of binds them to one situation, which is why it's so important. I don't know, I know at the university level, we speak to the state and we speak to different districts, but I wonder if districts get together and speak to each other and say, hey, this is our issue. How did you solve that? How did you solve that? And work collaboratively together for the greater good of the state instead of just, well, this is what my school district is and we're not telling anybody, right? How can we work collaboratively to make sure that all of our students are getting the best opportunity to learn?
Dr. Ansher, I want to ask you, does your programming or the future of students that you're kind of dealing with, is there any kind of teaching around teaching online for them? As far as their own development, the teachers that are kind of coming next, is there any training for them to teach online? Like as far as what it'll even happen, is there any kind of awareness that may be part of what they'll be doing for this next generation is teaching online?
Well, when our students are coming in this term, we actually are in the process of completely revamping our program. And so we are making it look amazing, making sure that we're supporting the needs of the 21st century learner. But my program's online. And so when the impact came, we were able to provide webinars based on standards, webinars, and we actually had adjunct faculty that developed webinars on what the teaching standard that is, what it looks like on ground, and what it would look like virtually. And so they were able to do that. And the state also provided webinars for students as well. So when the students took that initiative, we were fine. We were able to make the necessary needs to get them out. But the students coming in, as they're preparing for our student teachers are told that your learning could take place virtually, it could take place in a hybrid setting, and it could take place on campus. So they're told that there are these options, but there are also executive orders down from the state that continue to change on a regular basis. So we really don't know what it's going to look like. But we know that pushing forward, we're going to make sure that that student has the best learning opportunity that they can to continue their education. But if you think about it, these students that were from last term and this term, probably this year, are going to be so marketable because they know how to do both ground and hybrid learning, online learning.
Absolutely.
Counselors too. I had no idea that you could speak with a counselor virtually.
All day. Yes.
Are you kidding me? Why aren't we utilizing this service?
That's another show. Because I have a lot of answers around that as a therapist, because a lot of my therapists that work for my company were already doing it virtually. So when this happened, it was just like, oh yeah, well, I got like 5 of the patients now or whatever. Whereas other providers I know they're in private practice were just like, what do we do? What do we do? And I'm like,
right.
come on. And interestingly enough, my wife had to do, she had a doctor's appointment, virtual doctor's appointment for the first time with a provider we've been going to for years. And the provider who's older said, I think we're going to keep this. There's just certain doctor's appointments you don't physically need to go in for. You know what I mean? You just don't.
Right.
But I'm just like, part of me is just like, come on, y'all. Like, this has been here. So I think they always say God, works in mysterious ways. I think he's shifting the planet in ways that I think we can't even predict yet. And one of the things I wanted to say too for our listening audience also is that for any parent that's worried and has a lot of anxiety, appropriate anxiety, children are resilient. Mm. It's often us that hold them back. So I'm not so much overly concerned about my child being behind as long as I can say I presented it to them. Because again, going to that banking method that I mentioned, you still don't know what's sticking. No matter what I present to them, no matter how many hours, I still don't know what's landing and staying. But the best I could do, and any parent can do, I think even any teacher can do, is say, I presented it to you the best way I could at the time that I had it. But children are they're resilient. They're phenomenal at learning things, even through crises. Because some of our best people have come from bad backgrounds, traumatic backgrounds, and this could be considered some level of trauma on a level of what we would call the linear experience of education. But the kids will be fine. The kids will be totally fine. It's just parents freaking out. And I think a lot of times that the anxiety comes from, oh, now I have to adapt. My children are not concerned. I'm like, oh, son, sit in front of the computer. Or there's no, I don't want to. No, not even a drop. Like, how long I got to sit here? An hour. Okay. You know what I mean? So right. Gauge anxiety and worry. I want parents to honestly own that it's their own, and just do your best. Don't project that to the child. Don't project it on them that you're gonna fail because this is a hard time. Watch the language.
Yeah.
Watch the language.
Well, I also want to just circle back on what you were saying about trauma. I also want to acknowledge that the separation from the actual school environment can be traumatic for some. And, that sort of grief of missing those relationships with your teachers, with your friends, things of that nature, how that impacts our kids You know, maybe they don't have the greatest relationship with mom and dad. Maybe,
Great point.
you know, the
Great
household is not a
Great
safe
point.
environment, and there's a lot of, toxic behavior that's going on that they are now exposed to 24/7 and can expect to be exposed to that, for months on end with no real end in sight. Just recognizing, those things. So I know that has also been, on the minds of, educators as far as the overall home environment and what the students may be going through. So that's something to think about.
That's a really good point. I was thinking about, as you were saying, trauma. We want to make sure that as parents, as teachers, as counselors, we're providing a safe place for our students, because now that our kids, now that they're online, we don't want them veering off to another site or to some stranger who's coming into their life. We want to make sure that we're still monitoring them, but we want to also make sure that we're providing that safe space too, because we know that there's a lot of online issues when it comes to cyberbullying, cyber stalkers. So that another layer.
Definitely another layer. And before we get out of here, definitely want to say on the website for the show, mindright2020.com, mindright2020.com. We've posted some educational resources for parents. One of them being a website that can help families, lower income families, get internet, because that's critical right now. And also some pre through K online resources, and also pre through K schools that you can potentially enroll in. And then also there's counseling, the counseling agency that I own and work at, and Dr. Vanjie works at, Safe Place Counseling and Assessments. That's safeplace7.com. You can go to, because we do really have seen an influx of a lot of kids wanting to come in for therapy, and their parents bringing them in. And I think that comes from just the kids feeling overwhelmed also and needing to talk. So even if you don't come to our counseling agency, please find a place to go to for yourself, just to check in, and also for your kids. I think that's just needed right now. And like Vanjie was saying, there are people that are in homes that weren't safe before this happened, and they didn't want to be in before this happened, and now they're there all day. And I know kids that are saying, "Hey, I live in a dangerous neighborhood, so even if I went outside, that's
right."
And that was really concerning. That's very concerning, because I always project out how many other kids are living in this situation right now. So having a place to go and everything is critical.
Well, I definitely want to thank you both for your contributions to this topic this morning. I think that this was, great as far as being able to touch upon, the various aspects that, our families are dealing with the education system, giving some food for thought for our families, and also giving some food for thought for, districts and, universities and things of that nature. I really feel like this is going to be a continued conversation, because as we've heard on, some of the conversations with university leadership and as well as like government officials, like, hey, there is no plan at the federal level. Like, in the Black community, we often say nobody's come to save us but us. I think as an educational community, that is definitely where we're at. Nobody is coming to save us but us, as far as educators and how we, educate these kids. So I really feel like, this is a continued conversation. And, as things continue to develop and we partner and find ways to, provide some additional resources to families, I would say that reflecting on our conversation today, we are, as professionals, not in a place of analysis paralysis. Through this conversation, I feel like us just talking, we've been able to like brainstorm and put some things on the table that are really meaningful things for people to consider. So again, thank you, Dr. Anderson, for joining us. We'll definitely be back next week, Mind Right Radio, talking about mental wellness and, the impact to our communities. But this was awesome. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great. It was
Okay.
great.
Dr. Muhammad, anything final?
Look, when these people are out here protesting, go home, take a shower, and spend some time with your kids, because that's who you're protesting for. Thank y'all so much.
Right. So keep your mind right and your faith strong. We'll check in with you all next week.
Thanks for listening.